Alrighty, everyone. Welcome to another session in the Organizing the Green New Deal class. Today we are joined by Justine Burt, and she's going to talk to us about green financing and her work in this area. I'm going to do a quick bio, and then I'm going to pass the reins to Justine, and she's going to present to us for a little bit. And then I think there's going to be plenty of time for questions from the audience as well. So Justine is the Future of Work program lead at Manzanita Works, a nonprofit in the San Francisco Bay Area focused on improving the quality of life for workers and their families. Prior to her nonprofit work, she spent 20 years consulting on sustainability behavior change for alternative transportation, energy efficiency, and waste prevention programs. Her clients included NASA's Ames Research Center, the U.S. House of Representatives, Alameda County Stop Waste, businesses in manufacturing, distribution, wholesale, and retail, various universities, the Clean Coalition, and the Bay Area Recycling Outreach Coalition. She's also the author of The Great Pivot, Creating Meaningful Work to Build a Sustainable Future. And I'm sure she'll talk to us a little bit about that book today as well. So thank you, Justine. Excited to hear from you and talk with you today.
Thanks, Nick. I really appreciate the opportunity to share highlights of my book, The Great Pivot, with your group. So I'm going to share my slides. I want to be clear up front that I'm not a finance expert. I'm just sharing where 22 different green jobs projects found funding so they could hire people. Because if you have funding, then it's more likely you'll be able to create green jobs. So I published The Great Pivot, Creating Meaningful Work to Build a Sustainable Future 2 years ago, when my primary concerns about the world of work were that automation was automating away millions of jobs, and outsourcing had sent millions of jobs overseas. An increasing number of people were working in the gig economy, where they're piecing together an 8-hour-a-week gig here, an 8-hour-a-week gig there, 10 hours over here with no benefits. And so then COVID happened. And we learned how vulnerable and brittle so many of our systems are in our society. We saw healthcare disrupted, where kids go to school disrupted, where people go to work disrupted, public transportation. In the Bay Area, Caltrain ridership is down 94%, BART ridership was down 85%. We all know the airlines were disrupted. And most interestingly to me, given the work that I do in waste prevention, I presume the food supply chain was more nimble and could move materials around more than it actually could. And then a year ago, when things started to shut down, restaurants shut down, hotels shut down, schools shut down, and then we were walking through the supermarkets looking at empty shelves and wondering why we can't get toilet paper or our favorite foods. We were also reading that dairy farmers were dumping out millions of gallons of milk, and farmers were plowing under onions and throwing away lettuce at a time when more people than ever were going to the food banks looking for help to buy the basic necessities. So the picture you see here is a potato farmer plowing under his potato crop. So if our mainstream systems are that vulnerable to a pandemic, are our systems well set up for the challenges of climate change in the future, which will be orders of magnitude greater than what we're even facing right now? So I just thought it was interesting how our need to build more resilient, sustainable systems is even greater now that we've been through the pandemic of the past year. So the jobs issue is really interesting to me. When the economy contracted a year ago, we were down tens of millions of jobs, and it's climbed back a bit since then, but we're still down about 10 million jobs versus where we were a year ago. So those are jobs that need to be made up. But that's just the official unemployment statistics. If you look at the blue bar on the top right here, we officially have about 10 million unemployed people, and unemployed means U3 unemployment at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I mean, you actively looked for work in the last 4 weeks. You submitted a resume, you had an interview, but that's only part of the picture. We're also misclassifying about 4 million people who maybe had a few interviews in the last 12 months, but nothing really came through. We're not counting the 5 million people who dropped out of the labor force, who've given up, who aren't even looking anymore. And we're also mischaracterizing the lived reality of about 7 million people who are working part-time with no benefits when they really would like full-time work with benefits. So what Biden has inherited in this economy is about 26 million workers hard hit by the COVID downturn. And we could be creating green jobs for all of these people. So yesterday on the Organizing the Green New Deal discussion, I heard somebody ask about donut economics. So I wanted to share this graphic because as somebody who has an economics degree and a master's in environmental policy, I wish Kate Rayworth had been around when I was doing my economics degree. The guns versus butter graph in microeconomics totally confused me. And so she runs through in donut economics all the ways that traditional economics fall short. And she said, basically, at the end of the day, humans need to move to the safe space, the light green part of the donut. Between the overshoot that we're doing, we're pouring too much greenhouse gases into the climate, where too much nitrogen and phosphorus are flowing off fields into waterways. We're converting land too quickly. We have biodiversity loss. So that's the way we're overshooting in the biggest ways the planet's capacity to support us. And then there are all these shortfalls. People don't have enough food to eat. There's not enough shelter, clean water, enough housing. Everyone should have access to internet. We're seeing all the ways that our society is not providing the basics for everyone. So to get to the safe space between the overshoots and the shortfalls, that's the work that's ahead of us. So I want to start with a vision of a sustainable future and then give you 22 examples of different projects that have created green jobs and where they found their funding, so that you can share these stories with other people who might be really interested in doing something about decarbonizing the energy system or decarbonizing the transportation system, building a circular economy. We really have a linear economy in this country. We're only diverting about 32% of our waste for recycling and composting in this country, which means if we're a linear flow of economy. We're extracting material through manufacturing them, we're using them, and then disposing of them. There's a lot of work to be done to reduce the amount of food we're wasting. 40% of all the food we raise and grow is thrown away in this country at a time when the number of people going to the food banks looking for food is double. So it's kind of a shame to be throwing out food waste when people need food. And then, of course, in California, I'm in California in the Bay Area. Last fall, 4 million acres burned. There's a lot of work to be done to restore healthy forests, as well as healthy waterways. We could be sequestering carbon in the soil and helping bring back wildlife populations. Every year, the World Wildlife Fund does a Living Planet Index, and they now show that we've lost 70% of all wildlife since 1970. We could do more to bring these populations back. And so this, I know just transition is a really important concept when we're talking about the Green New Deal and the frontline communities that are bearing the disproportionate burden of pollution, those living near oil refineries, highways, ports, shipping ports, airports, living near confined animal feeding operations, living near agricultural fields where pesticides and herbicides are sprayed. If we switch to a more sustainable future, if we made the transition, these communities would bear less of the pollution. They would benefit as well from moving to renewable energy from fossil fuels. So there are a lot of benefits of making these changes. An article I published with Mary Chambers last summer on Medium, we took a look at who's already done the analysis of how many green jobs we could create, and we counted up 14.3 million green jobs could be created if, according to Mark Jacobson at Stanford University, if we switch to 100% renewable energy in our country. 5.2 million jobs right there. If we brought back the Civilian Conservation Corps, and Biden has talked about a Civilian Climate Corps, that was 3.4 million jobs back in the 1930s that pulled us out of the Great Depression. High-speed rail, if we had a robust national network of high-speed rail, that would be 2.5 million jobs. If we went from 1% organic agriculture to 100% organic agriculture, that's 1.1 million jobs. If we committed to recycling and composting 75% of our waste, that means fewer organics rotting in the landfill into methane, which is a greenhouse gas, 1.1 million jobs. Building energy efficiency retrofits, 800,000 jobs. Right there, that's over 14 million green jobs at a time when we need millions of jobs. So just in California, if we retrofit all 14 million buildings, 9 million single family homes, 3 million multifamily buildings, 600,000 commercial buildings, that's a lot of work right there. We have 345 hospitals in California. Each one of them should have a microgrid with solar energy storage, and then the intelligence of monitoring communications and controls so that when Pacific Gas and Electric cuts off the electricity because it's concerned about wildfires in the fall, that they wouldn't have to rely on diesel generators, that they could rely on solar and energy storage. There's a lot of work to be done. And so what I pulled together from my book is that there are all these different funding sources that have been used. It would be wonderful to have a federal Green New Deal, but there's a lot we can do while we're waiting for that to pass. Hopefully it will pass Congress, but if it doesn't, it would be nice if we expend some energy to creating jobs at the local level, at the regional level, at the state level. There's so much we can do. And government doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting. There's a lot that other sectors can do. There's a lot the private sector can do, the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic sector, as well as local and state government. And these are just some of the potential funding sources we could be looking into. I'll give examples of in the private sector where microloans have been used, crowdfunding, community capital, impact investing. We all know about commercial bank loans, but there's also project finance and venture capital. The nonprofit sector relies heavily on philanthropy and government grants, fee for service. And then as I was doing this research, I was wondering, what do we need government to do? Government doesn't need to do everything, but there's a few really key things we need government to do. We need government to set goals. Like in California, AB 32 said, we'd like to reduce greenhouse gases 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Setting that goal really set the stage for the private sector to then have the market certainty and to invest. We also need local government to put ordinances in place, and that sets the stage for the private sector as well. I'll give an example of that later. And then what we really, really need government for is to, where there's a negative externality, so here's my economics rearing its head, where there's a negative externality where a business has taken a cost and shoved it off onto somebody else who didn't ask to bear that cost. One of my best friends, her son has asthma. He didn't ask to have asthma attacks, and yet he suffers when the air quality is worse, when the wildfires are happening. So government's job in part is to look at those times when negative externalities are happening, levy a fee on that, and then use the revenues to pay for green jobs that will fix that, to do things in a more sustainable way. So government has at its disposal taxes, fees, green bonds. Here are some of the things we're going to talk about. Okay, so here are some examples. The green outline projects are private sector projects. So this is at the city of Fremont put in a lot of solar at its police station. This is a power purchasing agreement. So private sector investing in projects for city. And why not let the private sector that has vast resources, especially the financial sector, is looking for places to invest? Why not let them deploy capital where there's a return on investment? Because these projects are going to happen a lot faster if there's private money chasing a return. So I did a podcast a few months ago with Jigar Shah, who at the time was the president of Generate Capital. And the most interesting thing I thought that came out of the podcast was that he said, Justine, we've raised $1 trillion for climate solutions, $1 trillion, but we've only deployed 300 billion of it. We need more shovel-ready projects. And so what does it take to get these projects ready so that project finance, so that the private financial sector can invest in them? And I think it's interesting that Jigar just last week moved over to the Department of Energy's loan program, which oversees $40 billion in loan tools. So Generate Capital invested in $5 million in 6 microgrids in the Salinas school district. So they paid for design, build, own and operate, maintain microgrids at 6 schools. So there's solar, here you see the chart, energy storage banks, monitoring, communications and controls, and they've set up the contract so the school district pays the same amount per kilowatt hour and they get a return on investment for their investors. Every K through 12 school could be doing this, every hospital, every police station, every fire station, and there's going to be a return on investment. Does anybody notice the difference between this picture and the same space after it was renovated? So this is a 1-story concrete tilt up in Sunnyvale, and it was ripped out to the studs and then renovated. The lighter picture does not have any artificial light. It's all natural light. What did they do to make it so much brighter? Anybody want to put anything in the chat? Skylights, yes. What else do you notice that makes it bright? White ceilings, they put white fabric on the ceiling. And one more thing, a whitewash on the concrete on the floor. So the light comes in from the skylight and then bounces through the building off the ceiling and off the floor. And so you can see how by designing it this way that it reduces the energy use. Same thing for the HVAC use. Their HVAC system was 75% smaller because those skylights open at night. They allow in natural air to flush out the old air from the building. And this is work that we could be doing to retrofit the commercial buildings throughout our country. So here's another example of the private sector. This is a worker-owned cooperative in Boston. And what they do is they pick up compostable waste from restaurants and they compost it. And so they needed to cover the costs between the time that they wanted to be able to pay their employees, which is regularly, and the time that the restaurants will save money on their garbage bill by diverting compostable materials for composting. And so they did a direct public offering to raise funds to cover that gap, and they pay a return to the people who contributed to it. We've all heard of imperfect produce, which is now imperfect foods. And what I think is so interesting about this, where they're finding a home for the 2-legged carrots. You never see a 2-legged carrot in a grocery store, and yet they're finding homes for these ugly produce items or, off-spec items. They've received round after round of private equity funding because the private equity firms believe there's so much potential to take so much of the food that's currently plowed under and thrown away and sell it to people. Really slick marketing campaign, just because a carrot has 2 legs and a tomato has a lumpy shape doesn't mean, or a cucumber has one side of it's yellow, doesn't mean that when you chop it up, it doesn't make a tasty salad. So private sector could be switching more to reusable transportation packaging. So usually for secondary transportation packaging, you have cardboard boxes on top of wooden pallets wrapped in plastic stretch wrap. And the cardboard boxes may be recycled. The wooden pallets last 3 to 5 trips. The plastic, for the most part, is thrown away. Sometimes it's recycled. There are so many projects that would reduce our environmental impact if we just invested up front to make them happen. Private sector example is packaging. We could be doing ready to use recycled content in our packaging. Here you can see packaging made out of, for consumer products made out of recycled paper. Just so many options. The next sector I want to cover, where does funding come from for the nonprofit sector? And the David and Lucille Packard Foundation is one of the best funders of nonprofits working on climate change. They've got you can see their 990 IRS form here. They've got $7.4 billion of assets. But the philanthropies only generally give what they're required to by law. And they're required to give 5% of their endowment away per year. And they do that. You can see from the numbers here, they give about 5% away. I saw an article a few months ago that said, COVID's been this once in a lifetime emergency, and the nonprofits have really suffered a huge reduction in donations. Why don't we double the federal mandate? The IRS requires 5% a year. Why don't we double that just for 3 years? That would pump an additional $200 billion over 3 years into nonprofits at a time where we sorely need them. And the markets are way up, so clearly they can afford it. So here are some examples from the private sector. This is a Stanford student that was sent home early for COVID spring break. He lives in Los Angeles. He and some other classmates started a nonprofit called FarmLink. They were reading about all these farmers plowing under onions and dumping out milk and throwing away lettuce and potatoes, and sent home early for COVID spring break. They raised some funds among their friends and family to rent this truck, go up to Oregon, pick up 50,000 pounds of onions and take it to the Los Angeles Food Bank. There's so much more we could be doing to divert food that would otherwise be thrown away. Speaking of agriculture, this is a wonderful nonprofit called Kitchen Table Advisors. On the right, it's Anthony Chang. He and his colleagues consult with young organic farmers who know how to grow fruits and vegetables, but maybe need a little help setting financial goals, figuring out how to more efficiently market, distribute, do their QuickBooks, help them with business services, basically. And so Kitchen Table Advisors gets funding from family foundations, basically the food companies, Cliff Bar and other environmentally friendly food-based enterprises like that, and also donations. If they had more funding, there's more they could do. I've talked to a number of fledgling farmers who were applied for Kitchen Table Advisors help, but were turned down because they have limited resources. I would love to see them be able to do more to increase the percent of food that's grown that's organic from 1% to at least double digits. We're all concerned about plastics in the Pacific Ocean. So in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch between California and Hawaii, 46% of the plastics there is lost or abandoned fishing nets. And so here's Ocean Voyages Institute that their revenues are a little under $100,000 a year. They go out and pull out slugs of plastic from the Pacific and take them to be recycled. Does anybody know what fishing nets can be recycled into? Any guesses? So fishing nets are generally made out of nylon 6 plastic. So there's an Italian company called Aquafil that's working with, let's see, do we have guesses? Fabric leggings, very nice. So Aquafil works with volunteer scuba divers in Washington State, and they work with fishermen, and they pay the fishermen to cut off the parts of the nylon 6 nets that cannot be recycled and to fold them up into 1,000-pound bags. And then they're shipped to Slovenia, where the fishing nets are shredded and then pelletized and turned into textiles, socks, bathing suits, new carpeting, basically textiles. But there's so much more they could be doing with more funding. But this is my favorite story. So in St. Vincent de Paul, I don't know if you know the story, Nick. This is in Lane County, Oregon. The St. Vincent de Paul hired Mitra Chester. She's a fashion designer. She's now full-time at St. Vincent de Paul, trying to figure out how to upcycle the donations they're getting. And so her first week there, she noticed, so this is right down the street from University of Oregon. Think about this pre-COVID, because they hired her in 2016. So she pulled out of the donation pile, here's a lot of Western gear, here's a lot of military gear, put that out for sale, thinking students would enjoy wearing it to weekend parties. But then she noticed that leather love seats were coming in that were ripped and stained, and she started cutting them up to sew tote bags. And she noticed there were a lot of flannel shirts and hoodie sweatshirts, and she cut the sleeves off both and then sewed the flannel sleeves onto the hoodie sweatshirt bodies, put a bunch of those out. As soon as the students found out about it, so bought all of them. She made another batch, they all sold out. She took the average daily sales for St. Vincent de Paul from $500 a day to $1,500 a day. So that's an extra $300,000 a year they had to provide a safety net to people in Lane County, Oregon. I just think it would be cool to have people with fashion degrees spend their first 6 months or first year out of school, thinking with their creative mind how they can upcycle more of these donations, because thrift stores are overwhelmed right now. So many people have been home for the last year cleaning out their houses. A lot of these thrift stores haven't even been open, or people are dropping off boxes and bags full of stuff. If we can have people upcycling these materials into beloved new things, that would save a lot of materials from the landfill. Replate is a nonprofit that before COVID had been picking up extra trays of surplus prepared food at like a Salesforce conference or a big luncheon, and driving it, because they charge $40 per pickup, driving it over to the homeless shelter in Emeryville. Since COVID started, they've been taking donations and picking up food prepared for healthcare workers and driving it to them. But their business model basically is relied on philanthropic donations for their rent, their server, their operating expenses, and then donations, $40 per pickup to pay for their driver's time to drive the materials. A lot of nonprofits that do this kind of work rely on volunteers, which is wonderful, but we could create jobs if we normalize the fact that companies could be paying $40 per pickup, and that would allow them with the revenue to hire people. So now the borders that are goldenrod are local and regional government projects. This is the City of Berkeley's Tool Lending Library, which has been in place since 1979. That got started with a $30,000 community development block grant in the late 70s. And now it's this beloved amenity in Berkeley where people can come borrow tools for construction, landscaping, woodworking. They now have kitchen tools you can borrow. They're open again. They have an online reservation system, and then you set up a time to come pick up your tool. But wouldn't it be nice if everybody could borrow the tools if they don't use that often, rather than everyone needing to buy the same 100 tools that sit unused in your garage most of the time? So this is something where we could reduce our collective impact and save money and benefit the environment. The City of Portland in 2016 passed a Deconstruction Ordinance. So this is another key role that government can play that catalyzes green job creation. The City of Portland had been seeing hundreds of old Victorian houses demolished, torn down, smashed with big equipment, pushed over into a 40 cubic yard dumpster and hauled to the landfill to be thrown out. And the city, it was just breaking the city's heart to see solid oak wood flooring thrown away. Half of the value of this house is the framing timber that you see on the left side, because it's old growth wood. They were tired of seeing kitchen cabinets thrown away and clawfoot tubs and porcelain sinks and banisters and doors. And so they said, if you want to tear down a house that was built before 1916, then you need to deconstruct it instead. They've recently upped this to 1940. And for the first year, they gave $2,500 grants to anybody doing a project like this. And as a result, the city trained 14 people to do deconstruction. 2 of whom were right out of prison, 7 of whom were homeless, and the rest had entry-level skills. And then they started working, doing this kind of thing. And so think about it, if you learn how to deconstruct a building, you're also learning how to construct a building, or how not to construct a building, and why it's so important to have flashing above a window. So I just think this is a success story, and proves that there are certain jobs we need government to do that will catalyze the creation of green jobs. And the guy who started one of the building deconstruction firms bootstrapped the $10,000 he needed. He was looking at getting a commercial bank loan, but when he talked to them, they said it's going to be $100 of interest a month for you to take out a $10,000 loan. And he said, well, I need workman's comp, an old beaten up pickup truck, and some tools. I have $10,000 in savings. I'm just going to bootstrap it myself. And now he has 6 full-time people working for him. Protected bike lanes is work for city government. And generally uses some federal funds to do it. A few years ago, my family went on a big tour of Europe, and in every city we were in, Copenhagen, Berlin, Paris, northern Spain, Madrid, there were protected bike lanes, not white stripes in the road, but actually protected areas where bicyclists could ride and the cars couldn't hit them. I'd love to see more of these in the US so that a lot more people feel comfortable biking around. This is a picture of one of my friends having her natural gas water heater removed and replaced with this heat pump water heater. There's a lot of work to be done to retrofit houses and apartments so they're no longer burning natural gas for water heating, for space heating, for drying, for cooking. And for low-income folks in rental properties, I believe it's really important for utilities to subsidize this work. And then the last few examples have to do with restoring nature. So this is a photo from Marin Carbon Project. And if you lay out a quarter to a half inch of compost on land with native grasses, the grasses sink much deeper roots, and that's how you sequester carbon with that. Currently, they get some cap and trade funding from California, from the state government, where there are fees levied on generators who emit more than 10,000 tons a year of greenhouse gases. This is a wildlife overpass that just opened in December in San Antonio. And so you can see how many of these projects aren't going to happen unless government does it. There's no return on investment for the private sector when you put in a wildlife overpass. It's just something that we think is important. There's one going in Los Angeles. There's been a number of mountain lions that try to cross some of the highways down in Southern California. And so they're planning a wildlife overpass. There are also wildlife underpasses. You might have seen some of the video footage of that. But I think we need a lot more of these. And this is the most popular thing when I post on the Great Pivot Facebook page. People tend to love these stories and the video footage. Senator Dianne Feinstein, one of our two senators in California, is very proud of having gotten federal funding to help with restoring the salt ponds in the southern San Francisco Bay. You can see the orange areas are the not restored yet, and the dark green is the currently working on restoring area. The Bay Area also passed with a supermajority a $12 parcel tax. We asked the people in the 9-county Bay Area, all the counties touching the Bay, would you like to restore the salt ponds? It'll be $12 a year, and 2/3 of people said yes. And you can see people in the Bay Area volunteers planting native plants. And the people who are working the earth moving equipment love their jobs because they know how meaningful it is and how the work they're doing is going to restore habitat for wildlife. And so I think everyone deserves meaningful and purposeful work. This is last two slides of examples. This is a picture from the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s when to get out of the Great Depression, they hired 3.4 million young men aged 17 to 28, and it was only men, it wasn't women. But these guys planted 3 billion trees. We clearly could use something like that now. And then there's a lot of work to be done to restore wildlife populations. And when we do, there are other benefits as well. So this is a wolf in Yellowstone National Park. And ordinarily during the winter, because these wolves have come back, in Yellowstone, there's $35 million pumped into the local economy because people want to come and see the wolves. And so people line up in their rental cars with their binoculars just to see a wolf on a distant hill, and they stay in hotels and they eat in restaurants and they buy souvenirs. So a little investment by the federal government to bring back beloved wildlife populations has all these other economic benefits as well. So a lot of people are talking about green bonds as a way to fund some of this. And I wanted to give an example in California. Here are some of the municipal green bonds that have been issued. They tend to be for one big project. So you can see green buildings are in here, wastewater treatment facilities, mass transit projects, water systems, some are larger, some are smaller. The state treasurer's office, I interviewed someone there, said that they're the conduit issuer. So if a wastewater treatment plant is desired to replace an old facility, then the state will serve um, as a conduit issuer, which kind of vouches for this is an organization that you should trust and feel good about, that they're going to pay back. But green bonds have typically been used for projects where there's a return on investment. So the wastewater treatment plant is going to continue to charge users, ratepayers, if there's an installation of let's see, what's a renewable energy project, the utility has a stream of revenue coming from the ratepayers as well. What's interesting, I think, is that Germany issued 6.5 billion euros last fall of green bonds, but it went for things like research on solar and protected bike lanes, which don't have a direct return on investment. But the revenue stream they're counting on is the taxpayer dollars. So I think there's a lot more. This is growing. The number of green bonds every year is growing, and it's a serious opportunity that we should be looking into further for how to fund these green jobs to build the sustainable future that we need. So in summary, catalysts for green job creation in the private sector. Let's unleash the financial sector to invest in projects with a competitive return on investment. I would love to see the federal government double the federal mandate to 10% from 5% for the philanthropic sector, just 3 years. And let's think about government's role to help catalyze green jobs. Government's job is to protect the people, to benefit the environment, to do work that's in the public good. And so where government can levy fees on behavior we want to discourage and use the revenues to create green jobs, that's another option beside the Green New Deal that we've been talking about, which would be wonderful. So in closing, I just would love for more people to have Ikigai in their work life. Ikigai is a term from Japan, and it's from the Okinawa prefecture, which has people with some of the longest life expectancies in the world. So they have a great diet and a great lifestyle, but that people also feel useful in their communities well into their 10th, 11th decades of life. And so Ikigai means reason for living. And if we look at Ikigai through the lens of American work, you have it if you're doing work that you love, that the world needs, that someone will pay you for, and that you're good at. And so I would love to see more people have the opportunity to have Ikigai at work. And part of the reason I wrote this book was because I had seen green job after green job posted, 200, 300, 400 people apply for it. And then if 200 people applied, 199 people didn't get it, didn't get to do that work that was going to give their lives purpose and meaning. So there's a lot of work to be done to build a sustainable future. There's a lot of money that would love to have a place to go, and there's a lot of people who would love to have meaningful work. So if you get a chance to take a look at my book, The Great Pivot, you can find it at Chelsea Green Publishing, the electronic version on Amazon. And if you have any questions, my email is thegreatpivot@gmail.com. Back to you, Nick.
Awesome. Thank you, Justine. And folks who want to participate in the conversation, please start leaving some comments and questions in the chat. Yeah, the discussion, the presentation brought up a lot for me, Justine. I think there's like so many interesting places for intervention. And, you know, yesterday, Mitch kind of framed the economic situation from the like big, you know, public investment side of things, right? And how do we conceive of money? And this is more like, even we need it, but even without like a big immediate change in how we imagine public finance happening at the local level, there's all sorts of tools that already exist that can be utilized. And you know, we've talked a little bit off this chat about, you know, examples of projects that have floundered or worked, and what what happened and what didn't, and where are these essential points of entry. And there really is money. Like it's moving around all over the place all the time. It's not, we don't have a lack of resources. We basically just need to be creative in how to divert them. You had mentioned, and this is maybe like more of a comment to just start a discussion, but you'd mentioned local government, and you had some examples of Portland doing deconstruction ordinances and stuff. And I think Portland gets a little bit too much credit for being a green leader that it doesn't really deserve, because it's also like a big gentrification leader too. But and there are big questions of equity whenever you do anything in kind of the green world, because it stimulates demand from usually like higher income earners, and you have to figure out how to protect renters. But yeah, there's a lot happening here that's attempting to do exactly what you're talking about. So find those sources of revenue that are then going to stimulate these pieces of like a smaller localized economy that's going to be community controlled, that you're going to cycle resources in the community. So a couple examples of things are like the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which was a tax on retailers so like big billion-dollar corporations like Walmart, Target, and to put a 1% surcharge on their local sales through gross receipts tax. And then that capitalizes a fund of like $60 to $80 million a year that because it basically won by a ballot initiative. The folks that designed that in the Portland Clean Energy Fund Coalition designed it specifically for low-income, marginalized communities of color that are underinvested in our community. So now there's this big capitalized fund that's got this designed charter around how that fund is administered, and then people that sort of meet the grant guidelines can then apply. So it could be, adding solar to low-income housing, or energy efficiency type work, or probably in the near future here, like gas energy changeouts and or gas utility changeouts. And it will plug this hole and hopefully like start to stimulate the trades to start, adding more apprenticeships so that they can actually do this work. We talked, sorry, this is, I'm eventually going to get to a question. But yeah, we had talked kind of about this, this problem that's going on right now, where there's a big social desire, and then there's sort of like a lack of, there's not a lack of labor, but there's a lack of currently skilled labor that can do a lot of this work sometimes, or the labor is in one geography and not elsewhere where it could be, or it gets exhausted really quickly. And how do we fix that problem? Like how do we get the skilled labor component of this to work? What are your ideas on that?
Well, that's really interesting. There was a report that came from the state a few months ago talking about high road jobs and making sure that jobs pay enough to support a family, that have benefits, whereas you get more skills, that could have a career ladder where you get paid more the more skills you have. And the discussion was around, if we're going to decarbonize 14 million buildings in California, we're going to need tens of thousands of additional electricians, 80,000 additional electricians, and we already don't have enough. And so one of my friends who led new construction ordinance, new buildings must in the peninsula and the Bay Area must be fossil fuel free. And she was talking to one of the union people at the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And he said, listen, we can set up training for people, we can set up apprenticeships, but we need to know that there's going to be money there for people to do this work once they finish. I don't want to get people trained up and get their hopes up and then not have work for them. So it's like we have to connect these dots. Like there's all this work that needs to be done. There's all this money going to the utilities to pay for natural gas, to pay for electricity, but we could be moving over to renewable energy storage, microgrids, these retrofits of houses, and labor could have good paying jobs, but we need to connect it all up and create programs. So somebody needs to be the champion to say, okay, this is important, this needs to happen. Somebody force of will, charismatic, and can pull the right policy levers to make it happen.
Yeah, we have similar problems. The trades and I would say the kind of climate sector in Portland are almost always at odds because there was a big push to restrict like new large storage and transfer facilities for fossil fuel projects. Most of it slated for export as a kind of part of the retooling of the American energy economy over the last like 20 years or so. That's made us the biggest energy producer in the world now, oil and gas. And so the region has kind of been like, we don't want to build this stuff and we don't want to contribute to climate catastrophe, but we also don't want to take on the risk of like exploding and dying and these like terrible accidents that will likely happen. And so the trades get really angry about that because they want to build those terminals. Generally speaking, I think they will represent themselves as kind of pretty like value neutral about that, but it's exactly what you're talking about. There has to be like another pile of money that's already sitting there that then serves as incentive for, you know, people that want to do seismic upgrades or clean energy transition to like work directly with the trades and to figure out how to do that. So yeah, I would just say like folks who are, you know, in California, I think California and Oregon, there's some interesting examples of this happening or attempts of that happening, and it should spread. Pretty much local government can do a lot here in terms of setting the table. It's an area government where, and it's the least captured probably in a lot of contexts, part of government too. A lot of state legislatures will prevent like certain taxing authority to come out of local government, but they almost always have land use authority. They almost always have some kind of like command and control regulation. They almost always have access to building code. So they can almost always sort of like set a trajectory. We also talked about like foundations and funding in the past, you and I, and so much money is private now compared to, you know, percentages that would have been like 50 years ago or something because of policy choices that made it that way. But there is a lot of foundation money, like you said, that's just kind of sitting there waiting to, I mean, for me, I don't know if there are big NGOs and foundations that have thought about like direct investments, like trades training programs, right? Like, or has anybody gone to a community that's resisting pipeline and been like, we'll put like, you know, a big foundation, like we'll put $10 million into training for green energy, like in this community. I don't know if anybody's done that before.
Well, the job training is what's really fascinating to me, and I think it deserves a lot more attention and community discussion. I mean, obviously, the pipe fitters union, the people who are putting in natural gas piping, I mean, there's a lot that needs to be replaced in California if we're going to keep using, and all over the country, if we're going to keep using natural gas. But we could be, it might be appropriate to switch some of these thousands of people over to reclaimed water pipes, recycled water, purple pipes that are coming out of wastewater treatment plants where the wastewater has been through tertiary treatment, primary, secondary, tertiary treatment. So it's good enough to go on golf courses now and other non-potable applications. Could people who've been working in natural gas piping move over to recycled purple water piping? I mean, it's where it's getting the most attention are the coal miners. And up until recently, we had about 52,000 coal miners. During COVID, it dropped to 44,000. I mean, this industry is being automated away, and yet environmentalists are blamed for the reduction in the coal industry. I interviewed a county commissioner in Western Pennsylvania, and he explained, listen, you have people who are graduating from high school who are making $100,000 to $140,000 a year in rural Western Pennsylvania. They could buy a house, send their kids to college, go on vacation, buy a truck, buy a jet ski, have a wonderful quality of life with a high school diploma. Like, where else can you do that? And so it's this industry where they'll find a coal seam and they'll hire up and they'll mine that coal seam until it's gone and then lay people off. I mean, these people are working 6-7 days a week. They're getting a good income and they're just waiting to be called back for the next coal seam. well, if this industry is going away, what do we want to train them to do? What are they interested in doing? Because the Department of Labor is offering training for programming software for apps for smartphones. And is that really the best use of people who are experts in hydraulics and heavy machinery? Like, what does it make sense to retrain these people for? I mean, we used to have horse and buggies. We used to have like people driving buggies. We used to have coal mining where people would hand lift buckets of water out of the coal mines, and then we got the steam engine. Like, we've had transitions before. This is a huge transition. And how do we have this discussion with communities about what kind of work we want to be doing, what kind of work we need done, and to make sure they get paid enough to support their families? It's a really important conversation.
Yeah, there's I know some conversations around trying to populate just transition funds. It's a conversation that I became aware of that started in Canada. And I think that there's some talk about it in California as well. I know that Colorado just passed a bill last year that kind of like sets a foundation for just transition funds, but it doesn't really kind of fill out what that would look like. But the idea is that you'd have this fund that was capitalized, ideally off of some kind of like price on pollution or something like that. And then the fund, basically, it doesn't cover all the costs of like switching a job, but basically it at the very least, you can cover the difference between, like, if somebody goes to work in an industry, say that they're working in gas or something, and they're paid well and have good benefits, the fund would try to cover the difference. Sorry, my dog's grumpy. Cover the difference between what they might make in a new job versus like what they were making in the past. And there's like hole plugging, kind of like transitional type work. But yeah, I mean, that's also I think a big problem that I've seen is folks in the green kind of thinking have long assumed, I think that they've long assumed that you have to kind of like one-to-one replace like a lost fossil fuel job with like a solar job or something like that. And it may not work like that. That may not match up. And so there has to be some kind of flexibility that's in this transition that actually allows people to have autonomy and figure out what they might want to do, but not fall desperately into poverty in the meantime.
Another opportunity, I think, is that in California, we're spending $80,000 a year to keep people locked up, many of them nonviolent drug offenses. And so we're trying to cut the prison population because they're like 2 to 3 times the number of people that the prisons were designed for. And so instead of spending $80,000 a year to keep people locked up who no longer present a threat to society as determined by their parole board, if we could pay them $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year with benefits to do green work, there are all kinds of projects that they could be doing. And I think that would be a better use of society's funds, because when someone's released from prison, good luck getting a job after you're an ex-felon. And if we can have jobs waiting for them, jobs ready for them, that would not only give them an income, the ability to support themselves, and they would be less likely to reoffend and go back in prison because they can't get a job. Like, it's just, it could solve so many problems at the same time. So the building deconstruction, the recycling, driving recovered produce to a food bank, like there's so many green jobs we could be doing that would be useful to society so that people don't end up back in prison. If somebody gets a $10 an hour or better job, their recidivism rate's like 8%. Otherwise, it's like 60%. So we're spending way too much on prisons when people could be doing useful work.
And policing in general, I think, because part of the recidivism is cops find crime where they want to find crime, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's definitely sort of elements of that kind of, they incentivize and create that demand, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I remember a couple years ago, and maybe this is just a recurring thing that happens. Jay, stop. But when wildfires were going wild in California, you had these examples of like basically like prison laborers, like being employed as like near slave labor to go out and like fight fires and stuff. And it was just, for me, like a mind-blowing example of just like everything that's wrong with our economic system right now.
I hear you. I agree.
E is asking a question. Would you mind putting it in the chat, E? Do folks have questions in the audience? Take a sec here and let other people join the conversation if they want to. Oh, E says, sorry, just hit the wrong button. Can you tell me, Justine, you're in the Bay, right? What are some of the interesting things that you've seen going on in your community that you see as like opportunities for implementation of the type of principles that you've been talking about?
Oh, well, I'm actually working on putting together a tool lending library, which will also be a repair cafe and a makerspace in the Bay Area. And trying to figure out the business model for that, because if it's a community amenity where people can come borrow a plumbing snake when their drain's backed up, it's going to save them $200 not having to call a plumber. If there's somebody staffing the tool lending library who used to be a plumber and can explain, the basics of how to do it, then would that be worth $50 a year to somebody? And if it saves people not having to buy the same 100 tools that cost thousands of dollars and sit unused most of the time in their garage, then how do we create something that will be of benefit to the community? So we're doing the first one. It's going to be about $50,000 over 1 year between all the tenant improvements and rent and liability insurance, and then part-time volunteer coordinator and social media person to publicize it. So we want to figure out the business model, have memberships, and then replicate it elsewhere. I think every town should have it. And if 482 cities and towns in California, each one has 2 full-time people, that's nearly 1,000 jobs right there that will save people in the community money. So that's one project I'm really excited about.
Yeah, that's great. I was wearing earlier today, I was wearing my Klamath Falls Tool Library shirt around my house. And even in tiny communities like Klamath, which is like, 30,000 person town, really conservative, it's a model that works really well. One other thing I noticed, it may be different in the Bay, but like when you have some kind of like a tool library or some other kind of like amenity that's similar to that, it creates just like a cultural buzz around it. It sort of just like changes by existing. It just kind of like asks people think about different things that they might share and not have to have, and like keeping themselves. So there's like a communal vibe that you can kind of create just from like having those institutions. So that's really encouraging. Excited about that.
Well, I'm excited about the opportunity for the repair cafe once more of the population is vaccinated and we can come back together. But wouldn't it be great to build community and have people interact within generations, where a 60-year-old who knows how to fix a vacuum cleaner can show a 10-year-old who's really interested in mechanical things how to do it, and people can learn how to use tools. But also for frustrated parents who are tired of the kids on screens all the time, just to give the kids something fun to do in a makerspace, to play and build and do something that's building as opposed to consuming someone else's content. I mean, this past year has really driven kids even more onto screens and really changed our mental makeup. Let's give an opportunity to people to get back together once it's safe to do so and do something interesting.
Yes, in the field of electronics, especially, there's so much waste, e-waste, that's a lot of it is caused because industry has been really good about by license and contract basically preventing people from being able to repair. And so there's just sort of like a culture of throwing away. And I'm not sure if it's happened in California yet, but I know of some states and cities where there's they're basically like forcing these companies to allow repair now as a condition of being able to do business in their community. And imagine, like how many people have iPhones with, needs for repair, that if suddenly they're allowed to do it and the people wouldn't get sued by Apple or whatever, that could be a big source of labor as well.
Well, France just passed a repairability index. They require companies that make consumer electronics and appliances to calculate a number based on 5 different criteria to show how repairable that piece of equipment is in terms of, can you get parts? How much do the parts cost? Can you open it up without breaking it? Like there are a number of factors that obviously Apple's pushing back on that. And it's just by requiring that index, that number on a product, it sends a signal to the public about what's possible. So I'd love to see that here, but we haven't managed to pass it in California. I think there's some resistance.
There's a question in the chat from the architecture lobby. How can we expand this logic of maintenance and care to our inhabited environment? What institutions can enable this on a large scale?
How do we expand the logic of maintenance and care to our inhabited environment? Well, it would be nice if we could fix things. I had a printer several years ago that broke, and I took it into a computer repair place, and the guy said, "How much did you spend on this printer?" And I said, $99. He's like, "It's going to take me hours to fix it and buy parts. Just go buy a new one." Like things are just not made to be repaired. And I'm not sure it's because people don't want to do it, they don't know how to do it, or parts are just glued together now instead. So if we just give people a chance to have fun and come together and learn how to fix things, and require manufacturers to make them fixable, to provide manuals, to provide spare parts. I mean, I just helped my dad sell his house and move into assisted living, and his dishwasher was 15 years old. We had the repair company come look at it, and he said, "Oh, there's one part that you need that broke, but KitchenAid doesn't make it anymore, so we can't fix it for you." I'm like, it's only been 15 years. The dishwasher looked great. Why can't we fix it? I mean, this is another key part of government stepping in on behalf of the public good and saying, people should be able to fix things. You shouldn't glue things together so people break it when they open it trying to fix it. But I'm not sure if I answered the question. Could you tell us more? Waste market, similar to a carbon market. Well, yesterday I thought Mitch had a really important point when he talked about, we don't have time to mess around with a carbon market. We've been trying to do it for 30 years and it hasn't really worked. So we need to try something out. I think the reason I'm so excited about green jobs is you can't argue with it. I mean, we're going to create jobs so people can support themselves. Meaningful work that gives people a sense of purpose, and it's a leverage point to get the work done that we need done. We just need to find the money to do it, the public will and the money.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe actually take a shot at like opening up conversation based on this question around logic of maintenance and care. Something it brought to my mind, Justine, are you familiar with like the work of the Democracy Collaborative at all? Like any of the stuff that they put out?
No, I'm not.
They're really interesting. They're mostly operate on the East Coast, but they have done some work in the past on like the importance of what they call anchor institutions in a community. So you talked about it a little bit with the example of like, putting solar on public buildings and stuff like that. But basically they go in and kind of like do an analysis in the community. I think they did a lot of stuff in Cleveland where they'll be like, okay, there's like a hospital or a university here, and this is kind of like a central economic kind of like engine here, maybe public, it may be private, depending on what's going on. But you got all these services that have to surround this like institution in order to make it functional. And like, so if you're a hospital, you got like laundry services, you got to have like high level waste disposal. You've got to have, like the energy system has to be good. It's got to work when the power goes out because otherwise people die, stuff like that. And so they've been like working with, boards of trustees at universities and hospitals and things, and trying to basically like build in like just and clean and sustainable kind of like feed in to that sort of system. And it's really, really interesting. I think they've like managed to do it in Cleveland with like a hospital system where they got like, immigrant owned, unionized like laundry services to do like clean laundry service and stuff like that. So I'm not an expert on it, but every once in a while I see stuff come out of the Democracy Collaborative that's kind of exciting. And they're taking the approach, I think kind of similar to like what Mitch was saying. Like rather than maybe like seeing the world in markets, we should start by seeing the world in institutions as like things that exist and have like a nature about themselves, and like are, you know, in the case of like big institutions, materials cycle through, and like how can we change procurement standards or change labor standards, or have like a university with like a carbon reduction policy, and what would that do within its own supply chain? So I don't know, it's interesting ideas, I think.
There was I had when I worked at NASA Ames Research Center as a sustainability manager, I hired a professional storyteller that Jeffrey Hollander with Seventh Generation had hired, because he had wanted his entire 400-person workforce to be able to tell him stories about what more they could do to be more sustainable. And Rafe Martin told this story that I thought was really interesting in terms of keeping your eye on the long-term goal. He said, I ride motorcycles. I don't, but he said, I ride motorcycles, and I learned that when you enter into a curve, you have to keep your eye fixated on the exit to the curve. If you look at the gravel that's on one side where you could slip, if you look at the guardrail over here, or the tree, or the oil slick, you could, if you just focus on that barrier, that reason that could trip you up, you're not going to exit the curve. So keep your eye on the vision where you're trying to go. Peripherally, see all the problems that are the barriers that are around you, but stay focused on the vision so you can get where you're intending to go.
There's a comment in the chat talking about not only the need sort of for like a productive shift maybe, but in a material shift, but also the cultural aspects of this, and making, instead of like new shiny things being attractive, having like basically taking that cultural, I guess it's mostly like a branding and advertising social instinct, taking that on strongly.
Absolutely. I mean, once you learn that a laptop requires 40,000 pounds of mined materials, you know, if your laptop's not working perfectly, and just wouldn't it be nice if we could tune up our laptops and keep them going for 10 years instead of feeling like after 2 or 3 years that the mouse isn't quite working and this other part isn't working very well? Wouldn't it be nice if we could fix them? I would love to see more people pushing for repairability indices and make electronics so we can repair them. I saw an article recently where somebody went into a Swiss watch manufacturer, a Swiss watch repair person, and said, well, you look at this Apple watch, and it was glued together. And the Swiss watch repair guys like, this is ridiculous. We don't glue $10,000 Swiss watches together. We can repair them. You should be able to repair this. Gluing it together is just lazy. So yeah, there's a lot we could do to encourage each other to try to keep appliances and equipment and electronics going for longer. But we can also write our elected representatives to say, let's design for recyclability. Let's require that people can upgrade things. I mean, all the textiles and the fast fashion, the things we use 3 or 5 times, and then the fabric gets all pilled up and doesn't look good anymore. I mean, can't we buy better and have it last for longer, make things upgradable, fixable? I would love to see that become more culturally acceptable, to wear a shirt that has been sewn together from 10 old t-shirts that were given to a thrift store like Elizabethan does. Yeah, I'd love to see that happen.
Yeah, I'm sure most folks are familiar with the concept, but planned obsolescence is just like an idea that's been in our corporate culture for over 100 years now, where because you can make more money in the long term, you want to make things that break down eventually, so you have to buy new ones, and it's gotten to a point of just like total absurdity with, you know, the capacity of engineering that our culture could do versus like just the absolute trash that we make, just because it's supposed to die. Its life cycle is intended to be so short. And there's a question in the chat that basically says, how do you inhibit that, basically, right? And the answer is, part of it could be like market choices and all the rest, but ultimately it's like a government thing, right? Like, this is something that you can change code. I'm not a contracts attorney, but I remember when I was in law school and I was studying for the bar, learning a lot about the Universal Commercial Code, where you actually, you can reject goods if they're not delivered to you and up to snuff, right? And you can change governments from the federal all the way down to the local can change their definitions of what goods that are in an ordinary sellable condition actually means. And so I think we could legislate away a lot of the planned obsolescence if we wanted to. I don't think I've
Absolutely.
seen a movement toward that, but I think it's totally feasible and possible.
Well, I want to see top down and bottom up. So top down legislation, whether state or federal level, and then bottom up repair cafes so people learn how to fix things. I mean, just because it's not easy to fix things doesn't mean you can't. And so if more people knew how to do it, they could teach other people. And then we could make the case for pushing for other things to be fixed too. I'm giving a presentation at the materials conference, TMS, Material Sustainability Conference on Monday morning. And I'm going to start with a story of, I went to visit my mother in New Mexico a few years ago, and I looked at her washing machine, and it was from the 1960s. And I said, Mom, can I buy you a new washing machine? And she said, no, I know how to fix this one. The ones with electronics, you can't fix. And I've had that experience as well, trying to get a repairman in to fix a washing machine or a dishwasher, and they play with it for hours and they order a part and they come back and it still doesn't work, microwave. So yeah, we should be able to repair things.
So I'm just kind of Googling as we go here, but apparently there's a organization called Consumer Product Safety Commission that has the power to issue durability standards over products if they wanted to. So if anybody's like an aspiring campaigner wants to kind of like figure out what that might take to start moving institutions like that, would be an interesting
Well, I think it's really interesting. How long do we want things to last? Like, what's the useful life of something? If you have a plastic bag you get at a grocery store, do you want it to last for 1,000 years? No, you just need it to get your 4 grocery items home. So, and for my dad's dishwasher, we wanted it to last more than 15 years. So like, there's this really weird mismatch of planned obsolescence for appliances that KitchenAid thinks that 10 years or 14 years is long enough for a dishwasher, and they stop making key parts. And then there's single-use disposable packaging, which somehow ends up in the oceans, in the waterways, in the parking lots, that just persists in our environment. I just think if we did a better job making things more durable or reusable, thinking how long do we want this to last, I think appliances should last for decades. I shouldn't have to replace my washing machine every 10 years. So I'd love to have a public conversation, a societal conversation about how long things should last. And legislate, but also help people, empower people by helping them learn how to fix them.
Other questions in the folks have in the chat that you haven't entered in here yet?
So I just want to say I'm happy to hear people talking about circular economy things. A lot of the discussion I read on Green New Deal is about decarbonizing our energy system and our transportation system, and a little discussion on agriculture, but I'm seeing discussion around circular economy and reducing food waste kind of missing from that. So I'm happy to broaden the discussion to include other things that also impact the climate. Food waste rotting in landfills turn into methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And also the durability of products means if they last longer, then we don't need as many raw materials to make them. So I encourage everybody to think more broadly about green jobs than putting up solar panels and bicycles.
Yeah, it's been a little bit, they've been thrown away or tucked away in a dark closet somewhere, but in the kind of mid 2000s in Portland, there were a lot of planning for urban agriculture that was taking place, and a lot of planning around like materials cycling. And then basically like we had big changes in politics and everybody became like super developer centric, and we just were building up all the time. And so I think all those plans were, they could make a lot more money in real estate economy. So that just kind of became the thing that the brand of Portland was used for. But there are, in Portland at least, you can still find these like food systems plans, and I think a lot of other communities were doing it as well. But you really can do all this stuff almost at the local level. There's some stuff that I learned a long time ago. These are just like bringing up, almost past life kind of like activities that I had, but we were doing some agricultural, like gardening and urban gleaning type work in Portland. And we were thinking about ways of like selling money into like foods, or selling produce into food systems. And we came across like some rule, the federal rule that actually prohibits that, because basically it's like a protectionist rule for like contractors and people who sell to schools, usually really bad food and things like that. So there are some like political elements, but starting to map what those are would be like a really, really interesting project. Like what are the barriers to sort of like community driven economy that sort of exist in which agencies at federal and state levels. I would love to participate and see stuff like that happen.
Yeah, there's a lot we can do at the local level, definitely regional level, state level. In California, I've seen a number of Green New Deal legislation pieces come through. And the first one, the Assembly member Rob Bonta from Oakland, California put out there, just basically said, we support the idea of a Green New Deal. And I've talked to a number of legislators who are like, of course I support green jobs. What do you want? Write me some legislation. Tell me what you want. And so I wrote this book that included energy and transportation, circular economy, reducing food waste, and restoring nature. And I realized, oh, if I'm going to put together legislation with some folks, then it needs to be just looking at decarbonizing buildings, or just looking at transportation or materials economy. So it's a really interesting question. What do we want? What do we want to ask for? What do we need? How can government help be the catalyst for sending a signal to the private sector? This is a goal. Go ahead and invest in this, because this is going to be a thing. How do we let government unleash financial and talent to in service of this goal? So
yeah, maybe that's our work in this class and elsewhere, is to try to make sure that conversation around circular economy is really like starts to get tucked into the Green New Deal conversation. If it's missing, one of the things about Green New Deal discourse that I think is really interesting for me, and it makes me optimistic, is that it's, even though I'd say there's like some national groups, like Sunrise, and there are some figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others who are kind of like seen as kind of the like keepers of the Green New Deal discourse. I think it's actually bad for people who are interested in like organizing in politics to just like be like, oh, okay, that's just what it is now, right? And instead to take the Green New Deal as just this open, it's an invitation for creativity is what it is, and that's how people should treat it. And so rather than having keepers of that idea, it should be like, oh, okay, like people are generally interested in this conceptual framework, then let's like add to it and let's breathe life into it, and let's like bring the tools that we have at our disposal. If you're a builder, an architect, you have one way of kind of coming into that. If you're like a movement lawyer, you can come into it in a different way. If you just like working in the care economy and want other people to have good jobs and like feel safe at work, and you want kids to be taken care of, like you come at it from a different way. So yeah, I'm definitely on team treat Green New Deal as a floating signifier that we can fill in wherever we want to, whenever we want to, when it comes to mind.
I think you put your finger on it. A few weeks after AOC and Ed Markey announced the Green New Deal, I read it was like 14 pages long, and I talked to one of AOC's staff members and I said, Randy, it's only 14 pages long. There aren't a lot of details in here. It was the intent to just start the conversation, and then we as a society have a conversation about what we want the Green New Deal to be. And he said, exactly. We don't have all the answers. We just wanted to start the conversation. And now we want to know from you, what do you want it to be? And so I'm just hearing this from legislators who represent us, who do our work that we want to see happen. They're looking for direction from us. But what do you want? How do we catalyze this? Is it just energy and transportation? Do you want other elements? So I think I'm just ready for action, though. I mean, I don't want to spend another 5, 10 years discussing what it could be. We need 10 million jobs to make up for the ones lost in the last year already. And a lot of these jobs, according to the University of Chicago, there are 3 economists who did a paper last May saying because of structural changes in the economy, 30 to 40% of these jobs are just lost. They're not coming back. And so we've still got automation, which is automating away a lot of jobs. We've sent millions of jobs overseas. People are suffering in the gig economy. And left to its own devices, the marketplace is creating Amazon warehouse picker jobs and DoorDash delivery people, which I'm not sure that people working in the Amazon warehouses feel a sense of purpose. Maybe they do, sense of purpose and meaning to their job, picking stuff off the shelf all day and putting in envelopes and sending them to people. Like we need a little more thoughtfulness about what kinds of work do we value? What kind of resilience do we need in the future? Climate change is just getting started. We all know, and there's the conventional way we do almost everything is not the sustainable way. So creating jobs, not relying on someone volunteering 1 hour every quarter, we're just not going to get there fast enough. We need people working 40 hours a week with benefits on decarbonizing our energy system, decarbonizing transportation, building a circular economy, diverting some of that food waste that's still edible to people who can eat it, restoring forests, waterways, wildlife populations. I think there's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, I linked a couple of pages in the chat here around discussions in Europe that are happening around circular economy. Folks might have seen there's like a green European deal that has been advanced for a couple of years now, but there's finally some financing that's going into it since COVID started. And so there's kind of, documentation coming up around different ideas for reshaping of the European economy. So that could be something to look at. And then the Dutch have been, at the front end of thinking through a circular economy for quite some time. So if folks are looking for inspiration, those are decent places to go look. And there's a point in the chat here that says, expanding on the circular economy, you also need materials that are the result of fair trade and fair labor as opposed to free trade. Have you done any work on that side of things, Justine?
I know how important it is. I really focused on examples in the United States. For my book, there's just such a different set of issues going on in Central America, South America, India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa. So I really appreciate them bringing up the issue of fair trade and fair labor. And it gets at the idea of what's the bare minimum that everyone deserves to have in their lives, whether in the United States or in developing nations. Everyone deserves to have access to food and shelter and access to a doctor and education. And at this point, the internet, try to apply for a job in the United States, try to have your kids go to school over Zoom if you don't have reliable internet. What's the bare minimum everyone deserves? And so fair trade and fair labor is about, in my understanding, in developing nations, if that's the right term even anymore, that people are paid enough so that they can support themselves. So I'm really glad that they brought that up.
Yeah, this is also a place where local government can be a good spot to organize. Local government, depending on the size of your bureaucracies and stuff, they procure a lot of materials, and so you can set procurement standards through code at the local level, and that can be a part of like creating a market signal. Another kind of like failed experiment, I would say, from Portland, a valiant failed experiment was to impanel like a fair trade council of like volunteers that made recommendations to the city. And basically they started to get into investments and who is handling the city's accounts, because usually like a city's investments and accounts will be handled by a big bank because they're the only institutions that have the type of infrastructure that can actually like handle those sorts of volumes. And so like the Fair Trade Council was basically recommending like disinvesting from like every fund that we could possibly be in and not using banking services. And the city basically like disbanded the group over time because they like functionally wouldn't invest in a banking system and like, or like a public bank or something. But it does, I mean, it's the kind of scalar pieces of that. I feel like we're doing pretty good in some communities at like the like micro scale of like, here's an operation, we can figure out how to make it work. And then, you know, there are some kind of like larger scale, like planning things and like figuring out how that middle and that transition works. That's where all the meat is, it feels like right now. So yeah, invitation for creativity for me, like whatever discipline you're in, if you're kind of drawn to the space of the Green New Deal and wanting to build out in any of these areas, just start doing stuff, honestly, because so much has to be done. It's like, you know, for like a full multi-decade economic transition, you know, like nobody's thought of everything and nobody has the capacity to like hold this stuff in all their minds. So we shouldn't just sort of be like, oh, okay, those people have it taken care of. It's not going to happen if you have that attitude.
Truly, truly, we're in an interregnum, this time between kings where neocolonialism and neoliberalism and this kind of predatory extractive capitalism that we have, it's falling apart. It's vulnerable, it's brittle, it's exploitative, it's just not working for most people or the environment or wildlife. And yet we know a lot of us have a vision of what needs to happen, but we're in this in-between time where it's all hands on deck. We need to steer the Titanic away from the iceberg or we're going to hit it. So yeah, just if everyone could just pick the issue they care most about, the problem they see needs to be solved, and apply their vision of what needs to happen at their local level and show other people how to make your solution work, then I think we can do this. If we feel, my biggest frustration with the Green New Deal is that I think a lot of people are sitting on their hands waiting for this to pass in Congress. And it may not pass. It may, but it may not. And in the meantime, we're losing all this time talking about what it could be and trying to get it through the gauntlet of people who don't want to see it happen, the vested corporate interests. So where can you like find your own shovel and dig in and plant your own garden to make this resilient, sustainable future happen? There's a lot of work to be done.
Totally agree. Well, we're close to 5:30 now. Maybe Justine, if you want to kind of like sing us out with a closing statement of some kind here, or any parting thoughts, or how folks can follow your work and communicate with you. Yeah.
So I have a Facebook page, The Great Pivot. I hope you get a chance to share my book with other people. It's filled, probably not surprisingly, with a lot of inspiring stories. And I wrote it at 2 levels. If you're a skimmer and you really just have 15 minutes to flip through, there's a lot of tables and charts and subheaders and chapter highlights, but there are a lot of inspiring stories if you really want to dig in. I would like to leave everybody with one final story. In 2017, I mentioned we did a grand tour of Europe, and I went to visit a friend I met my semester abroad in Madrid, and she lives in northern Spain. And she said, Justine, we have to go on a tour of our cathedral in town. It's on the top of the hill. It overlooks our main plaza, and we're really proud of it. So we're walking through this Gothic Spanish church that was, they started construction in the year 1296 and they finished in the year 1437. And I'm walking through this cathedral that's grand and beautiful with its pointed Gothic windows. And I thought, the people who started work on this church in 1296, the architects, the stonemasons, the funders, the philanthropists who made this happen, they knew they wouldn't be alive when it was finished. And yet they still endeavored to work on it. And so they were thinking about people centuries into the future that would benefit from this church. And are we as a society thinking when we create a styrofoam cup or a plastic bag, are we thinking about the well-being of people 6 centuries from now? And I was getting really frustrated. Like, here are these people who are thinking about my well-being, walking through this beautiful church, and what are we doing? And but then the more I thought about it, walking through with these stained glass windows and all these gorgeous aspects of this church, the more I thought, well, we are trying. I mean, we're putting in solar panels and we're putting in windmills and we're trying to recycle. We're just not doing it fast enough. We're just not devoting enough resources to planting new trees, to making our forests healthier. So I would like us to take more of a cathedral view of this and think about generations, years, centuries from now, and how we need to step up and do more and convince others that it's time to do more, because the way we're doing things currently is not the sustainable, resilient way.
Totally agree. And it feels like we've got some momentum now. So let's see it through. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Nick. It was fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Justine. And I hope that I get a chance to support some of the projects that you have going on in the Bay. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks everybody for joining. This will be up on YouTube right away. And if you're watching this later, yeah, feel free to ping either Justine or I for a conversation sometime. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.